G'day everybody, Patrick here, and today we're going to be continuing the tutorial for Serverless Framework with part 5, where we are going to be making a front end to go along with our restaurant ordering system backend. It's going to be a really interesting tutorial. We're going to be using React for the front end. If you're not familiar with React, that's fine. You can still follow along with what I'm doing. If you're really confused, that's also fine. I will have put all the code up in the GitHub repository where you can have a look, and if you are really stuck, you can just clone the repository and use that. But if you follow along with everything I'm doing here, you should be okay. You don't need to know React inside out. A bit of experience with it would be helpful, but that's fine. It's going to be a very simple application, and I'll give you a run through of what we're making. So we're going to make a table, and in that table, we're going to list names and orders. So for example, John might order fish and Sally might order salad. And then we have above that table, we have a set of inputs, the name and the order input, and then a submit button. And when someone types their name and their order and they submit, it saves it to the database. And then when the application is loaded, it's going to load all of the orders from the database. So this would in theory work across multiple machines. If you have, let's say, a restaurant where people are placing these orders, you'd have multiple computers, one on one side, one on the other side, and they're going to stay in sync with each other. So that's the motivation for this and the idea. It is a very simple application. It's not designed to be anything fancy, missing plenty of functionality like deleting and reordering and expiring orders and things like that. But the idea is to illustrate how we can make a serverless application that communicates with the database in the most simple way possible. So to get started, what we're going to do is I want you to go to a new folder, and I want you to, I'm going to go out of this one. We're going to go create this application. So you're going to need to use yarn to create this application with the default settings. We're going to go yarn create React app, and we're going to give it a name. So I already created one called restaurant orders just while I was experimenting with this tutorial for you guys. So I'm going to create a new one called order system. And this is going to take a little while. So basically what happens here is yarn goes out and gets all of the relevant packages to make this React app. It's going to bootstrap it for us, create some basic files that is like a simple animated spinning logo that you can then view in your browser, packages everything together, sets some sensible defaults for it, sets up a Webpack build, all of these different things, and it's all handled for us. So this is a pretty great way to create a basic React app without too much custom config. It does take a little while though, so I'll skip forward to when this is done. All right, so this is all complete for us, and so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna open this React app, and the way that we're going to do that is, you see ls, we go cd order system, and you can open this in whatever code editor you like. I'm just going to use VS Code, so we can go code dot, meaning open the current folder in a new window. Just as a side note, if you did try to run code using the command line and it didn't work, and you do have VS Code installed, what you can do is you can go Command Shift P or Control Shift P, and you go type shell, and you can see here it says install code command in path. You want to run that, restart VS Code, and then what you can do is you can run code with particular folder, and it will open that folder in VS Code for you. It's a little tip. We're going to start by just looking at what it looks like to start with. So if we go yarn start, it's going to open a browser window for us. It's going to probably complain because we're already using port 3000, so that's fine. We'll just go yes, and it's going to run it on 3001. And you see here we get localhost 3001. Okay, and it's started up. Now this will automatically update on reload. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to app.js, and we're just going to delete a lot of this. So everything between the div class app and the end of the div, we're going to delete. So you see here, and we're just going to get this, and it's all going to disappear on us. Gone. So that gives us a blank slate to work with. And one other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go Option Shift O. It's going to delete the unused imports in VS Code. If you're using a different code editor, you'll need to know the shortcut for that, or manually delete. So we've got div class name equals app, and what we're going to do is we're going to install Material UI for a table. I don't like doing the old style table, t-head, blah, blah, blah. There's just too many compatibility issues, and it's old and it looks bad. So we're going to use Material UI table. It looks a bit nicer. And the way we're going to do that, open a new terminal tab or window, and we're going to go yarn add at material-ui/core. And so Material UI is from Google. It basically gives you a bunch of tools where you can make your applications look like Android apps or Google Drive, if that's what you want. You can theme it quite well, and it's quite nice to use. So I generally gravitate towards it for most simple projects. It contains a lot of different components you can use as well. So if you go to materialui.com, you can see here, for example, there's all these different icons you can use, which is really nice. And you can see here on the left, there's an entire design philosophy based around this and a big React library, which is what we're using here. And so what we're going to be using for this is we are going to basically put in a table that allows us to see all the names and orders. So we're going to do that first. And the way that we're going to do that, I have a little bit of code. I'm going to copy paste and I'm going to replicate. And I'm going to call this table old.js so that we can make our own and copy all of it in. So table.js. I always think it's easiest to, if you write this yourself, you're going to remember it better. So we're going to use the old style of React with components rather than using hooks. There's still in use components all over the place. I was recently working on a work code base that has mostly components. We do have some hooks in there. And the reason for that is they're just very stable API and everybody knows how to use that if you know how to use React, whereas hooks are a bit newer. It is gaining maturity and popularity, and I do quite like hooks, but we're not going to be using that today. We're going to go table, and the first thing we want to write is export class table extends. We'll say basic table because there's already a class called table we're about to import. Extends component, and that's our beginning. So this is using the class-based system, and we're going to need to extend the React component class in order for that to work. So from React, all good. And so the most basic thing we could do here is we could go render and you can return something from the render function like a div that says hello. So that would work. And if we go into the app, what we can then do is we can go basic table and import that component. So we're going to go import basic table from table. Okay. And so now if we reload our app, I'm going to close that. Export default. There we go. So we get this hello coming from that table. So we've imported one component into another. So the first thing we want to do is return a table container, component equals paper. And so this is the overall container for the table, and we need to import both that and paper from material UI / core / paper, and then maybe potentially component / paper, and table container from table container. This will work, and we can put put a hello in here, just see what it looks like this time. And probably shouldn't change too much because the table container is just going to do positioning and things. So it's given it a bit of a border, and you can, if you zoom out, you can see it's like got some border radius and so on. But it's pretty basic at this point. And so now what we're going to do is actually put a table in this table container, kind of similar to how you would do it with the old style CSS, but it's got much better cross-browser support and looks a lot more modern. And then table row. So we need to import all of these things. Often you can auto import, but it doesn't seem to be working for me today. So we're going to need to do that on our own. So then we need to go /table and table head and table row. Okay, so that's a start. And the next thing we want to do is table cells in there. So we're going to go table cell name. We're going to have another table cell that is order. And just for fun, we're going to say align equals right. Right. It's going to right align the text in that table cell. So that gives our table a header, and then we've got table body. And in the table body, we also have a table row, table body. And you can see here, we've got table row again. And in that, okay, so this is where things get a little bit more complex. So what we're going to do is, to start with, we're just going to define some default values. So const rows is going to be equal to, it's going to be an array of name, Patrick, order, beans. Don't know why. I don't really like beans that much. Like, I don't mind them, but okay. And then name is Lily, and Lily has ordered salmon. That should be lowercase consistency. Okay, that's two things. There we go. And so then what we're going to do is we want to put this data into our table. So if you're not familiar with React, this is where things are going to get a little bit confusing, but just bear with me. So what we're going to do is, for every one of these rows, we want a table row. So we want to go rows.map. Remember the curly braces as well. So rows.map, and then for each row, and in fact, we're going to just extract out the name and the order from the row. And then we're going to return a table row like this. If you're familiar with React, though, this is easy stuff, right? So, and then we want to return a table cell, and we're going to put the name in one of those table cells and the order in the other table cell. So that should be really the basic gist of it. And okay, we haven't defined table cell because we haven't imported it properly, but once we get that right, it'll actually display everything that we wanted, most likely. Let's find out. Boom! So there we are. This was actually not aligned right, so we need to go align equals right. Okay, so you see the power of Material UI now makes it nice and easy to do things that don't look terrible from the get-go. It doesn't look great, like we could obviously improve this a lot, but it's not too bad. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we actually want to make a request to our API that we made in part 4 of this tutorial to get this information. So the way that we are going to do that is by creating a component did mount method. This is one of the lifecycle hooks that is going to fire every time this class is like instantiated, basically. And in this component did mount method, we're also going to make a load rows method. And what this is going to do, I'm going to make this as well. This is a very important thing, is we need to go make this an arrow function. So this one we don't need as an arrow function, but this one we do need as an arrow function. The reason is otherwise we can't reference things like set state. And we are going to reference set state in this. So I may as well make it async. Yeah, I'll make it async as well, because making async request. So we're going to go const response data we're going to extract is axios.get endpoint URL. And what I have just done right now is a mess, because we don't actually, I haven't explained what this means, I haven't explained what this means, I haven't explained what this means. So Axios, let's start with this, is a request library. So we go yarn add Axios. It's kind of like running fetch on the browser, but it's a bit nicer. And so I like to use this all over the place, honestly. It's good. You can do .get, .post, .put, whatever. And so then endpoint URL is something we're going to need to define. So we're going to go hence endpoint URL is equal to, and for the moment we'll just hard code this at localhost 3000/dev/orders. So that is going to make this request to this URL, and then data, what actually happens here is we get like a response, and the response object is going to contain a field called data. So we're just immediately extracting that. We don't care about the rest of the response. And we also need to do something I forgot, which is await. So if we don't await, then we're just going to be extracting data from a promise, and that's not going to work. So we need to await that, all good. So this is the line we want. And let's just log the data for the moment and see what we get from it. So now if we go to here, oh, and the other thing as well is when you install new libraries, you need to restart the application. So if we restart this, it's going to take a little while, it always does. I'm going to go npm yarn start. Oh, hang on, go yes on this and start that one. Cool. So sorry about that mess. So basically I just ran, I'll do it again. So we go yarn start, and it's going to ask, do you want to start this on a new port? And we go yes. Start in development server, and here we are. So now it's reloading, and like I said, could take a little while, so I'll skip forward. All right, and we're still getting this Axios is not defined error, and the reason is because I'm stupid. We need to actually import it from Axios, and that should fix it. So now when we refresh, it will, so did it log anything? It hasn't actually logged anything. Oh, now, once again, stupidity. You guys are probably catching these mistakes all over the place, and I could edit them out, but I like to leave them in so that you guys can see, like, this is the realistic, this is what it's like actually building an application. You just make silly things that you forget, or you type the wrong thing, or you forget to import. It's stuff like that. So we go component did mount, and we need to actually go load rows. And we're not going to await the load rows because component did mount is not asynchronous. So we need to go this.load rows as well. Cool. Now this works. It should log. Yeah, it's logged its response, and it got the response. It's like Patrick wants beans. Awesome. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put this into this state of the component. We're going to go state equals. Some people do this in the constructor. Nowadays, I'm pretty sure you can just do it like this. So we go state. Again, a lot of people have moved on to using hooks now, so these problems are not a problem anymore, but something to keep in mind. You don't need to do, you can do constructor is useful for a lot of things. You props, you go super props, and then you this dot state equals blah blah blah, and then people do their binding the methods and all that, and you can do that if you want, but I find the less boilerplate the better. So in this case, if you use an arrow function, you don't need to bind the method. So state is equal to rows. It starts off as an empty array, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to go this dot set state Again, I told you this is going to be a simple application. Rows is just data. So we're not, verifying the data is what we expect or anything like that. It's just going to set it, and then we don't need to do this. Const rows is going to come from this .state. So we're going to destructure like that. And now it should say Patrick Beans. So what we've done now is we made a front-end application that actually loads this request, which comes from a scan on the database. Next thing we want to do is we want to make it so that you can create new items. So what we're going to do there is we're going to go into the app. We don't need this table old anymore. I can delete that. And in the app, we're going to add just before the table a new div. And in that div, we're going to have 2 inputs and a button. So the button is going to say submit, and the input, they're both going to be type is text, and so this one's going to be value is, we'll talk about this in a sec. So what you actually need to do here, it's given us app as a function. So I'm questioning here, should we bite the bullet and do this as a functional component just to demonstrate what that looks like if you haven't seen it before? It's gonna be very simple, so we may as well. Let's go, and for this, what we're gonna do is we are going to use the use state hook from React. And we're gonna go const, so we say new name and new order. Oh, hang on, new name and set new name is equal to use state, and the default will be empty. And we'll go new order, new order, and set new order. It's gonna be the same. So what this is doing is it's basically the equivalent of declaring this in the state, except because we're not using a function, we're using a functional component, it's a function, instead of using a class. And you can mix and match these, by the way. As you can see, I've got one that's a class, one that's a functional component. This didn't intend to be a React tutorial, but it seems like it's becoming one. Anyway, I'm here for the full stack developers, right? So I think really everyone at some point is gonna, yes, you can specialize front end, you can specialize back end, but having a bit of experience of both, even if you're mainly like front end or mainly back end, is helpful. And my channel is also focused on cloud side of things as well. So I sort of think like a 3-pronged full stack where you've got like back end, front end, DevOps. So we're talking about all 3 of those here, which is really great. We're developing a back end, developing a front end, and doing a bit of DevOps, getting it all deployed, debugging, using CloudWatch logs, and so on. So yeah, really happy about that. Back to this very front end problem that we're dealing with. So we've got this new name and set new name. We've got input type is text, and the value of this is going to be just the new name. I'm calling it new name because it's the one that we're about to create that hasn't been created yet. And then new order. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put the on change in, and that is going to be a function where you're going to use the set new name function. And so this is going to be we need to pass in the event, really. We go event set new name, and it's going to be e.target.value. And then we're going to do the same thing here. On change is set new order e.target.value. So what's going on here is it's going to be updating the state every time we do this. And this is an example of using a functional programming sort of system where we're declaring a new function that takes this and then extracts out the value into that to set the new name. Button on click is we want to go handle submit, and we're going to create this. So we're going to go const handle submit is equal to a function, should make it async, why not? And we're going to go await, again, Axios, and I'm not going to be stupid this time, I'm going to import it. Await Axios.post this time, and it's going to be API, was it endpoint URL, I think, and that should be good, except there's one problem, which is that the endpoint URL is defined in here. So we could layer bad software engineering practices on top of each other and try and export this from here and load it into this, but does it really make sense to store the API URL in the table file? Not really. So we should make a new file called constants.js, and in that we are going to store the endpoint URL, and then we can export it. So using this sort of constants file is pretty common practice. You use like a utilities file and things like that as well. I would recommend it for separation of concerns. So we're going to go endpoint URL from constants. Yeah. And we can do the same thing in the app file. So you go up here like that. Great. This should basically work, except there's one big problem. We haven't passed in the info. So we need to go name is new name and order is new order. And then we should also clear the fields. So we go set new name just blank again and set new order to blank again. Let's have a look how it looks. So we've got this, and we'll add placeholders just to make it clear what's going on. So placeholder equals name, placeholder equals order. And so we've got Patrick wants beans, and then we're gonna have Jack wants scrambled eggs. Cool, submit. And you notice it doesn't update. However, if we refresh, then it updates. So the problem with our current system is that we haven't got it automatically updating when we submit, and we haven't got it updating if someone else comes along. Now, surprisingly, the current setup makes it very difficult to handle dynamically updating when we submit. It's possible, but you have to sort of create your own observer system and things like that. So to get around that, we can just set up a polling system, but I will add at the end of this video a bit of a bonus for those of you who want to see how you might do this. You could also use a library like Redux, which is basically built for this, but if we want to avoid Redux, it's still possible. Because what's actually happening is you notice that the app is the parent of the table component, and so passing down that info to the table component, you can't really pass down events, you can only pass down data. So you'd either extract the state up from the table into the parent, which is perfectly valid thing to do. So you're passing rows down to the table, but if we didn't want to do that, there's a few other ways around. But what we're going to do right now is we're just going to make it on mount. We're going to go set interval, and so we're going to say poll interval is null. We want to store a reference to this interval so we can clear it, and we're going to set interval. So poll this dot poll interval is equal to set interval, and we want to pass in this dot load rows, and then we determine how often do we want to poll. So let's say 5,000. So every 5 seconds it's going to poll. We've got a problem though, which is that if we unmount the component, this interval is still going to be firing, and it's like basically a memory leak. So we want to fix that by going component will unmount, and we go this dot poll. We're going to go clear interval, this dot poll interval. Probably check that the interval exists first, like that. So that's a good start. Okay, let's see how it goes. So now if we add a new one, I really struggle coming up with these names. I'm not gonna lie. Sarah would like to have cereal. Okay, there we go. And now, there you go. Within a second or two, it popped up. And the cool thing is we could open up multiple browser tabs and they're gonna stay in sync with each other. So if we go now, Mary wants bread. She's a really simple girl, just wants bread. And watch this, it's popped up. Awesome. So you could, in theory, have this, over a network, multiple computers all doing this, and it's using a database that is shared between all of them. So we may be running the API locally, and we'll look at running the API not locally as well, but the database is actually stored somewhere in a data center that AWS owns, not us. So great work. The next thing I want to do quickly is show you what it would look like if we get this all deployed. Can we get this API endpoint working remotely rather than locally? And indeed we can. So we're gonna go SLS deploy, and this may take some time, so I'll skip through it. One thing to note just quickly while it's actually waiting on the stack update is that the file has reduced in size. So it was initially 27 megabytes something, now it's 9.54. So if you look at the package.json, the dev dependencies are being excluded from that deployment. The AWS SDK is still being included. That's where the 10 megabytes or so comes from. And look, it's done. So we get this post and get endpoint. We just need to copy one of them because they're exactly the same. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to, it's the right one, yeah. We're gonna go here and we're gonna go to the constants, update this API URL, the endpoint URL, and you may have different ones for different environments if this was a real project with multiple stages. And now we can test, and we've got a problem, it's not loading. So if you look here, we've got console, and we've got a status code 502. This is indicating that something has gone wrong, and so we need to look at CloudWatch logs to try and fix it. And this happens all the time, so don't stress out about this kind of thing. This is par for the course. You definitely expect problems like this to arise. There's one I can foresee that's going to happen, which is the cross-origin resource sharing is going to be an issue. So we'll need to whitelist localhost in that case. So let's go to logs and view log groups. Find the right one. What was it called? Tutorial, something like that. So we've got list orders and post order. Let's go list orders, see what's wrong with it. Yes, access denied exception. So this is a big one. This is when the endpoint can't actually access DynamoDB. So when we were running this locally, the serverless framework is using my AWS credentials, which have full access to my AWS account. So that is not going to be any problem when we're running locally. But when we want to run it in Lambda, we need to give the correct permissions. So the question then becomes, how do we do that? So if you go to the serverless.yaml in this backend, we can update to give the correct permissions. So here's one I prepared earlier, and we can do this at the provider level so all the functions have access to it, or we can do it at the function level. Let's just do it at the provider level to keep it simple. We've got the IAM role statements, and the IAM role statements are going to be affect, allow, and then all of the things we want to do to DynamoDB. So you notice here that we actually have provided all of the possible things. We don't want to do that though. We actually only want to have put item and scan, because they're the only ones we should be doing. So principle of least privilege, you should only be allowing the things that we want. And then what we need to do is select the correct region. So it's going to be potentially different for you, but I'm AP Southeast 2. And then you need to put your account ID, and then the table is going to be, whatever we called the table was restaurant database. Okay, so that's how we can provide those permissions. And then once again, we have to redeploy. So skip forward. All right, so here we are. And this endpoint is going to be the same as it was. So you can see here the 5CTN, 5CTN. So if we refresh this, what we're going to get is probably a different error. Oh, no, it's working this time. How is it working? I was expecting an error on this one. So we're going to go name, then order fruit. And there we go. We finally have the error I was expecting. So apparently this isn't applying for GET requests, but it is applying to this POST request. So it says here, it's been blocked by the cause policy. Response to the pre-flight request. So the pre-flight request, if you look at the network, so you'll be making an options request that tests whether we're allowed to actually make a request to this. So it says here, request method is options, and we got a 403. So we never wrote 403, you remember that? This is actually coming from API Gateway and Lambda itself, basically not permitting us by default to make what's called cross-origin requests. So cross-origin requests occurs when you are on one origin, so this is localhost, and we're making a request to a completely different website. And this is a browser feature, and it's used to make sure that people aren't making websites that are, say, stealing your bank details. Because if this doesn't exist, what you could do, for example, is you could make a website that loads facebook.com behind the scenes in the client's browser using their logged in credentials to Facebook, and then what would happen is you could get, their friend list and all their posts and things like that. And then you could send that back to your server. So to prevent that from happening, browsers have this feature called CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, and it prevents by default most of these requests. So if you want to allow them, you have to explicitly allow them from the API side, not from the browser side. So what we're going to do is go back to here and you see our functions. What we can do is we can specify cause true, and it's pretty much as simple as that. We're going to do cause true on this as well, just for good measure. You can do more in-depth cause settings, so you can allow specific origins, or you can allow when credentials aren't present and things like that. So this isn't going to work if the user is logged into your website, for example, and you're sending all these credentials over. I've had difficult problems with that in the past. It gets really confusing to handle, and I might make a video on that at another point. How do we do cross-origin resource sharing with credentials enabled? But for this type of system where there's no authentication, it's acceptable to just put cause as true. Unfortunately, we're going to need to once more deploy this service. So I'll see you in a minute when it's deployed. All right, it's all deployed, and we can now refresh this page. Hopefully, the only error we're going to get is the keys error. So let's submit. Oh, I have to think of more names. All right, these are very white people names. Let's go with Akshay. All right, and Akshay would like some Coca-Cola. All right, so we're going to submit orders. You can see we made GET requests to get the new ones, and before that there will have been a POST request to post this order. It says created, all good. And there we go, and it will synchronize between this one as well. So we've got this all working remotely, perfect. The one thing I did want to fix is this key error. So if you haven't seen this before, essentially this table we haven't specified keys for. So let's fix that. Pretty simple to do. All we need to do is, you can see we've got mapping to a table row. We need to provide a key, and we can say the name is the key for that row. And then error's gone. So we're all there, all done. Now it's time for the little addendum for those of you who want to stick around for some more advanced React, how we can pass this info down to the table component. You don't need to continue with this if you don't want to go really deep with this, but I want to provide a little bit of info on how you can actually set up your own observer, and it can actually lead into how Redux and similar libraries work under the hood. So here's the problem statement, right? So let's say we had, instead of a 5-second wait time, we had a 15-second wait time, right? And we create a new person. You can just make fake names. I didn't even think of that. We're waiting ages for this to show up. So we want it to show up immediately, but we also don't have to be polling all the time. So, you could make this 100 milliseconds, but you're putting a lot of strain on your server in that case, on your, well, serverless application in that case. And, you do get charged for each Lambda function and the execution times and so on. So we want to keep this at a medium thing. So we'll leave the polling on so that we're synchronizing between these two pages, but let's maybe make it 10 seconds. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pass down a way to invoke this poll interval function when we want to call it. So what I'm going to do is we want it to basically go load rows. We want to be able to call this load rows from the app. We're going to pass down what I'm going to call the load rows hook, and it's just going to be a function which will, same name, load rows hook. So const load rows hook is going to be this function where we pass in the load rows function that we want to be called, and then we're going to go set load rows func load rows func, and then we can use state. We could use a ref here, but let's just keep it simple and use state. We'll go const load rows func. We might need to rename this new load rows func, and set load rows func is equal to use state, and we'll just default it to null. And then what's going to happen is once we do this handle submit, we're gonna say load rows func and load rows func. And this is a bit confusing syntax, but basically I'm checking, does this exist? And if it does exist, then we call it. So basically what we're doing now is and this needs to be this one, they need to match. What we're doing is we pass down the load rows hook to the table component, and then it can set its own function that it wants to be called when this happens. So then in the component did mount, we can go this.props.load rows hook, and we're just going to go this.load rows. So essentially we're telling the component above it, hey, when you want to call this load rows function, here it is. So if we've got this 10-second wait time, normally if we create a new order, it's going to take a really long time, up to 10 seconds to load the order after it was created, but now it should load immediately. So Bob, back to the white people. Bob just wants a sandwich, man. Go save, and okay, what's going on? It's not a function. Okay, why not? I'm gonna go, let's debug this. Again, I want to demonstrate what it would look like when I was debugging this. So we're gonna go console log new, and we're gonna go console log current when it gets called, and load rows func. We haven't actually explicitly checked that it was a function, but I was assuming at this point if it's defined it will be a function. So it's a promise. Why is it a promise? Okay, so it seems like, so we're passing, that's very strange. Was new ever called? So new's this function, right? Okay, so I've worked out what the problem is. This is a really obscure little thing with React that has got me before. So what we've done is we're passing this in, right? Set load rows func. It's a set state hook, and the set state hook expects, so you notice here, right? We're passing in new and it's a function. And then we get current and it's a promise, meaning we've called the function somehow. Now set state, you can either pass in a value, but if the value is a function, then it's going to expect, there's a different format you can go, set something where you go like the previous value, and then you want to go the new value is like previous value plus 1, for example. So you can pass in a function here in terms of the previous value when you're doing set state. But we don't want that. We want to literally just pass in the function. So we're going to do this, and this should work. So basically what's going to happen here is we don't care about the previous value. You could check the previous value if you want, but we don't care about it. So we're just going to return it. All right, so unfortunately my screen recording cut out at the end of that, but luckily we had just got to the end of the functional part of the video where you actually build the application. So if you're following along with that last bit where I set up the observer system, if you follow along to the end of the recording, it will have worked and everything will be as expected. If you did have any issues, just because this video did get a little bit cut off, just let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to respond to you. Other than that, everything's complete. We've finished part 5, so we've now built the front end for this application. And so that's really awesome. Congrats guys for making it this far. And then in part 6a and 6b, we're going to be looking at a back end and a front end for an even more complex application where we've got some image resizing happening, some event-driven systems working with AWS S3, object events, calling a Lambda function, and there's going to be a pretty interesting architecture behind that. So stay tuned for part 6a and 6b, and then you will have finished the serverless course. So thanks for watching everybody. Please give this video a like if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and I'll see you all in the next video.